Hey guys, it's Erin. Thanks for tuning into my presentation where I will try to explain a little bit about the mummy's curse or the curse of the pharaohs without delving into the topic of the curse of Tutankhamun. With no further ado, on with the show. So, what the heck is the mummy's curse anyway? There are actually a lot of misconceptions surrounding what it might be or might not be, but at the end of the day, it's exactly what it sounds like. A curse visited upon someone who disturbs the final resting place of a mummified individual. Basically, you disturb the tomb or the body, and something horrible happens, usually your death. These curses tend to be attached only to Egyptian mummies for reasons that we'll get into in a minute, but the concept in popular culture dates back to the Victorian era and is absolutely related to the idea that curses can be attached to the disruption of a grave. Of course, fears of disrupting a grave or even violating the corpse of a human being that was once alive never stopped the Victorians from having a good time. Mummy unwrapping parties like the one depicted here were all the rage in the 19th and into the early 20th century, which in turn is probably linked to the development of a whole slew of fictional works dealing with mummies and the consequences of unearthing and unwrapping them. So, how exactly did all this get started? Honestly, there's a few factors. The West was absolutely fascinated by all things Egyptian throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, which helped fuel many of the early excavations in Egypt, setting the stage for Carter's eventual discovery of an undisturbed tomb in the Valley of the Kings. The concept of the mummy's curse, however, predated the opening of that tomb and has a slightly more complicated history. You have to understand that for an extremely repressed population, people in Victorian era Europe had some very interesting and dark fantasies that stemmed from a vast array of social, religious, political, and economic pressures during the period. Some of those fantasies and insecurities were expressed in fiction. Works like Dracula and Frankenstein are familiar to us even today, but what's not so familiar is the wide array of both long and short form fiction about mummies. Jane Webb Loudon wrote her book The Mummy in 1827, and the work depicts the 2126 resurrection of the pharaoh Khufu, the builder of the Great Pyramid at Giza. How hardly grateful for being resurrected, Loudon's work portrays the pharaoh as despotic, and he spends much of the novel critiquing the society he's found himself in, which is basically a future version of the Victorian era in which Loudon lived. However, her work paved the way for many others, including fiction where individuals found themselves encountering resurrected or undead mummies, for both good and ill. The mummy's curse as a formal concept might have actually arisen in a work by Louisa May Alcott. Yes, that Louisa May Alcott, in a piece from 1869. She used the mummy's curse as a plot point in this work, and that in turn may have inspired the rumors that swirled around after the sinking of the Titanic, that the ship's loss was due to its transport of a British Museum mummy aboard. A false claim, but a popular one nonetheless, and one of the many stories about mummies' curses in popular fiction and the news. Of course, the idea of a mummy's curse has been perpetuated in popular media throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, starting with the mummy from Hollywood in the 1930s. The 1990s remake is probably much more familiar to all of us, and The Mummy's Hand in 1940. These are only a couple of the many horror flicks that Hollywood has produced featuring a mummy's curse as a major plot point, and that's helped to perpetuate this myth of a mummy's curse. So, what's the truth behind it? The actual historical truth? That's a little more complicated. There's a story that painter Joseph Smith told about Akhenaten, the father of King Tut, that claims that he was cursed by the priests of Egypt after his death to wander eternally, his body separated from his soul, as punishment for his abandonment of the traditional Egyptian practices of polytheism, and to some degree attempting to create a monotheistic Egypt worshipping Ra, the sun god. This may or may not have been a true tale, but it's the one that's been repeated over time regarding the mummy's curse. There is some archaeological evidence for curses, but most of these actual curses come from old tombs dating to the Old Kingdom and typically aren't linked to royal burials. Any royal curse seems to be one that actually applied during the lifetime of the royal who is basically invoking the curse. In fact, most of the inscriptions that people claim are as evidence for a curse are actually either mistranslations of the hieroglyphics or misinterpretations of those translations, usually translations by amateurs and misinterpretations by the press. Today, in academic and social and scientific circles, The mummy's curse has as a concept has been revisited, but not in a way that anyone would actually typically think. Scientists are digging into the idea that microbes, fungus, viruses, bacteria, and other detritus of the past might actually be the root cause for the so-called mummy's curse and have played a role in some of the deaths that are attributed to said curses. More research is necessary, but some of the early conclusions definitely point to disease and disorder surviving in the tomb and being passed along to modern populations. And here's some sources that I looked at to put this together if you're curious about them. Thanks for watching, and I hope everyone is doing okay during their quarantine. Have a great day. Bye.